I'm Major Garrett in Washington, and welcome to the Takeout. This all looks very different, and I promise you I'll explain in just a second. But there was a very big news today, and I promise you we're going to get to a lot of that news. The Middle East, Federal Reserve decision on interest rates, an important Supreme Court ruling, and we're also going to have an interview with the FDA commissioner. But let me just explain what you're seeing and, more importantly, what you're not seeing. In addition to all the news I just summarized, we had a bit of news at CBS in downtown Washington, D.C. A couple of hours ago, we had a power outage. When the power goes out, a lot of things that we need for television are no longer usable, like that set, too dark for TV, like our control room where a lot of buttons are pushed and communications are made to me so I can carry out a show. No control room, no studio. We have to find another location. How do you do that? Well, you bring it on wheels. This is what we call a studio van in the business. I'm inside one now. It's parked in the garage just behind CBS News in downtown D.C. The studio van, there you go. You see it there. It's the one in the black one. I'm in that one. I think in a minute or so, our control room is going to roll over some pictures of me getting in here about 15 minutes ago. And that's how we're putting the show on the air. So we don't have, there we go. I know who that fella is. So we don't have all the regular things, but we still have a great show, and we're going to get you the most important news. I told you things in the Middle East remain very newsmaking. Remarks from the president today saying nobody knows what he's going to do. There is a sense in the region that the United States might get more involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran. For perspective on all that, I want to go to Holly Williams, who comes to us from northern Iraq.
President Trump has called for Iran's unconditional surrender. And today we had a response to that in a televised address by Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. His tone was bellicose, as you might expect from the Iranian leader with his country under bombardment. He said that Iranians do not respond well to the language of threats. He was defiant. He vowed that Iran would never surrender to coercion. And perhaps most pertinently for Americans, he said that any U.S. military intervention will, quote, undoubtedly result in irreparable damage to them. Now, Iran has already accused the U.S. of being complicit in Israel's attack and has threatened to retaliate against American military bases. There are many U.S. bases here in the Middle East, along with around 40,000 American troops. But perhaps the most obvious target for an Iranian retaliation would be the roughly 2,500 U.S. troops here in Iraq, simply because they are right next door to Iran. If the U.S. does get directly involved in this conflict, and if Iran then chooses to retaliate, the question is what Iran is capable of now. Israel already has air superiority over Iran after just a few days of war. And while most attention is focused on nuclear targets, just yesterday Israel said it had hit 12 missile launch and storage sites. Back in 2020, Iran targeted a U.S. base here in Iraq with ballistic missiles. But could they still do that? We don't know for sure. Holly Williams, CBS News, Erbil in northern Iraq.
I want to turn now to my CBS colleague, Charlie D'Agata at the Pentagon. Charlie, what's the latest there?
Well, you know, you could say that the Pentagon is preparing for war, right? That sounds like a dramatic statement. But when is the Pentagon not preparing for war, Major? You know, the atmosphere here could be described as a little bit jittery last night. Not quite that feeling today, but we were told by several sources, defense sources, that they are bracing for any kind of Iranian retaliation. As Holly just said, 40,000 troops throughout that area, the Middle East, not just the ones possibly the most vulnerable at that base in Iraq, 2,500 service members there. But you've got the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, you've got Kuwait, you've got the UAE. You know, there are several potential targets for Iran to aim at. And we have learned from intelligence service members that the Iranians, as they said, are aiming some of those missiles and other weapons toward U.S. bases and interests in the region. So, again, Pentagon's a planning organization. They're planning for what may come. They're also flooding the entire area with a massive amount of military equipment. There's a carrier strike group that's been there for a while, the Carl Vinson. There are several destroyers with it, some in the Red Sea, a few more at the coast of the Mediterranean, so also in that region. And there's also another carrier headed there, the USS Nimitz, that is being redirected there from the Indo-PACOM region. And there's also going to be the USS Henry Ford headed to the Europe theater of command. So a lot of stuff headed in that direction. There's a new squadron of F-16s, F-35s, F-22s that are sent there, refueling tankers. That's really important because that not only enables some long-range bombers to increase their range should there be a U.S. attack in Iran, but it also gives fighter jets the opportunity to loiter because what Secretary Hegseth has referred to time and again, this is about force protection. These are defensive measures, and you want to have planes that can loiter over areas, particularly parts of Iraq, anywhere near that border with Iran, the Red Sea, anywhere where there are U.S. military assets, you want to have fighters in the air to protect them.
And Charlie, it has been said more than once that there is particular U.S. air power and armaments necessary if the president so decides to substantially degrade underground nuclear facilities in Iran. And the likely place that those B-2 bombers would leave from is Diego Garcia, so I have read. Is that part of this, the matrix we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, we know that the B-2s were Diego Garcia. We can't confirm that they're still there. We do know that B-52s are there. Both of those aircraft can carry what you're referring to, the 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator. It is a big, heavy bomb, and only a couple of aircraft are able to carry it and deliver it to its target. And yes, that would be the knockout blow. The Israelis have their own form of bunker busters, but nothing with the kind of penetrating power of that particular weapon. So if the United States were to engage and try to take out Iran's nuclear facilities with a sort of knockout blow, it's very likely that that kind of weapon would be used because the Iranians, especially when it comes to their nuclear facilities, are deep underground, literally in a sort of mountain, underneath a mountain. It's got cement and steel reinforced, and there aren't too many weapons that can get down there. Certainly Israelis don't have it in their arsenal or the delivery to do that. And I also have to mention here, the Israelis have talked about owning the airspace, and I know President Trump said that we own the airspace. They have all but knocked out most of the air defenses, as we understand it, in Iran, which enables Israel's fighter jets to fly over with impunity and take out targets, including Iranian leadership. So it may be that one of the options that President Trump might be considering is he doesn't want to imperil U.S. fighters, fighter jets, or bombers, or personnel. But if he feels that that area has been cleared of any serious or significant air defenses, he may be more confident to deploy American fighter jets and bombers over Iran.
Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon, thank you very much. I want to bring in Wendy Sherman, who served several high-ranking positions in the Obama State Department and was a key part of that team negotiating with the Iranian government about deterring and slowing down and making available for international inspection its nuclear program. Wendy, I'm very glad you're with us. This feels like a perilous moment in the region and for the United States. Does it to you?
It does to me as well. I think it's a very dangerous moment. I think both Holly and Charlie gave a great summary of what's going on. I think there are a couple of things that we all have to be aware of. What's the end game here? Even if the United States uses what's called the MOP, the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, to try to destroy Fordo, we don't know whether it actually will destroy Fordo and all the enriched uranium that is there. We can't bomb away knowledge. So we may set back Iran's program, but it doesn't mean they won't recreate it and try to do it secretly and underground. We don't know what is really enough for the Prime Minister of Israel, what would be enough for the President of the United States, and whether, in fact, as Charlie pointed out, not only those 40,000 military personnel in the region, but there are American citizens all over the region visiting, touring, probably 200,000 or 300,000 Americans in Israel alone. So there is a lot at stake here. I think it's important the president is putting assets in the region because if he does take action, we better be prepared for retaliation. And that can be terrorist actions, that can be cyber attacks, that can be the use of drones, That can be the remaining missiles that Iran has, and several other things that they may use their proxies to undertake. So there's a lot at stake here, a lot that is unknown, a lot that is very dangerous for the United States, and the entire Muslim world may be up in arms depending upon what we do.
Wendy, I want to read something that just came across about a half an hour ago out of London. It says, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, put his cabinet on alert for a possible U.S. attack on Iran. British officials said the situation was, quote, grave and volatile when the Prime Minister's team discussed whether the president, meaning President Trump, might seek to strike Iran's nuclear facilities from the joint U.S.-UK airbase at Diego Garcia. Interpret what I just read to you, based on your experience with the United Kingdom, diplomacy in general, to our audience.
I would say Prime Minister Starmer is trying to be prepared for any eventuality. It's probably a prudent thing for him to do, but it certainly does add to my nervous making about what might be coming our way. The president, as we know, likes to act on instinct, but when you are going to take this kind of military action, if he does, you can't do it on instinct. You have to be prepared. You have to know what the first, second, third effects are going to be of such action. You have to prepare for all of them. It's just now that the U.S. and Israel is providing perhaps charter jets or ships that can take Americans out of Israel. That kind of planning should have been going on for some time, given that Israel's been under attack for 5 days now. So we are in a very tough place, Major, very tough.
Wendy, how do you evaluate what we know, maybe more importantly, what we don't know actually about Iran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon and its ability to deliver it?
Look, Major, none of us want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. All of us which wish Fordo and all the nuclear facilities didn't exist. So I think we're all on the same page. The question is, how do you get to the best outcome? President Obama actually is the one who commissioned and deployed that massive ordnance penetrator because he wanted Iran to know while we were negotiating that if that negotiation failed, he was prepared to take whatever military action would be necessary to ensure that Iran never had a nuclear weapon. The deal that we got really had the most extensive monitoring and verification, didn't allow Iran to enrich uranium above 3.67%, and really constrained its stockpile and many other elements of its program. And it gave us eyes and ears on what was going on and a channel of communications with the Iranians. President Trump decided to leave that deal, and that is why we are where we are today, with President Trump now having to make an incredibly difficult decision, not only for the security of America, but the security of the world.
I'm glad you summarized what was in the nuclear deal negotiated by President Obama, because it may be an off-ramp here. The president has said, and so have his close advisors, that they are open to the prospect of a civilian nuclear program in Iran, provided it does not highly enrich the material, and that can be verified by international inspectors. That sounds very close to what you just summarized, and may, and I underscore that word, may, be an off-ramp.
I hope there is a diplomatic off-ramp. I think one of the errors here, quite frankly, Major, is the president set out a deadline, which he likes to do, and says, let's get a deal in 60 days or we'll see what we do next. You cannot negotiate this technical a deal in 60 days. And the president went back and forth. Would Iran have to dismantle its entire program, or just as you just said, ensure that it had very low levels of enrichment under verification and monitoring? If you want to completely dismantle the program, I don't believe that Iran will ever agree to having no enrichment, because it believes it has that right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We don't believe that, but they do. And many of our European countries and allies believe that the NPT gives a country that right for peaceful civil nuclear programming. So given the pride that Iran has, that it's a resistance economy, that it had its revolution in 1979, I think it won't back away from that. But we'll see what they might be willing to do given how much Israel has degraded and decapitated their military, how they have diminished Hezbollah, Hamas, Syrian militia, and put Iran absolutely in a weaker position.
Wendy Sherman, thanks as always for your time, expertise, and perspective. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Major.
We're going to take a quick break, coming to you from a studio van just outside of CBS News headquarters in Washington, D.C. We're going to talk about an important Supreme Court ruling today on minors and transgender therapies and restrictions therein when we come back. Welcome back to the Takeout, where most definitely the show must always go on, coming to you from a studio van outside the CBS News Washington, D.C. bureau, because said bureau is still paralyzed by a power outage. And if you're just curious, what's the air conditioning like in a studio van? Suboptimal. But I want to thank everyone who scrambled to make all this possible on the fly to keep us on the air so we can talk to you. There was an important Supreme Court ruling today dealing with access, or the limits therein, in 27 states for minors seeking gender-affirming care. I want to bring in Jeff Rosen, who is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, for his perspective on that. Jeff, always great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Explain to my audience what the court decided today.
It's an important decision. The court upheld a Tennessee law that restricts sex transition treatment for minors. A bunch of states have passed these laws, and it forbids minors from getting puberty blockers or hormones for the purpose of transitioning. And the court, in a 6-3 decision, said that this law doesn't violate the Constitution because it doesn't classify on the basis of transgender status. Basically, it prohibits people from getting these hormones if they're under a certain age for the purpose of transitioning, but it doesn't prohibit using treatments for other purposes. And therefore, it doesn't trigger what's called heightened scrutiny. Now, this could have had huge implications if the court had come out differently and said that any law that mentions transgender status is subject to heightened scrutiny. Then all sorts of differential treatment of trans people, from sports teams to bathrooms and so forth, might have been subject to constitutional analysis. But under the majority's ruling, although these laws that forbid sex-based treatments for minors are okay, the court did not reach those broader questions about the status of transgender people in other circumstances.
And Jeff, do I understand it correctly that among the things the court ruling said was, in the majority opinion, that states have a defined and therefore constitutionally legitimate interest in protecting minors from potentially life-altering interventions, of which the court ruled this would be one?
The court did hold that states may conclude that they have a legitimate and important interest in preventing those harms. The court said that there's a lot of debate in the U.S. and around the world about whether or not these treatments are harmful. And Chief Justice Roberts said it's not the job of federal judges to second guess those questions. That's something that states should resolve on their own as part of democratic debate. And it is perfectly legitimate for a state to conclude that these treatments cause harms and therefore they can be banned.
Does this in any way, Jeff, implicate a larger question about parental rights?
It does not implicate the question of parental rights, although, of course, this does restrict parents from allowing kids to have these treatments, but it very much impacts the broader question of transgender rights. And basically, it gives states the discretion to reach different conclusions about how to treat, in particular, transgender kids in this circumstance, and doesn't constitutionalize the whole question of transgender rights. The three dissenting justices, Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson, would have subject any law that discriminated or treated transgender people differently to heightened constitutional analysis. That would have federalized an awful lot of laws, as I mentioned, from sports teams to bathrooms to other areas, and made them subject to judicial review. The court avoided that by holding that these Tennessee laws aren't subject to heightened scrutiny, and therefore suggested that this is going to be resolved not in federal courts, but state by state.
And just as a practical matter, Jeff, if you are a parent in a state with these restrictions, can you go to a state that does not have these restrictions and obtain the care for your minor if you so desire?
Yes, you can. There's no federal ban on these treatments. Some states choose to allow them. And if you want your kid to have these treatments, you can go to a state that allows these treatments.
Jeff Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. Always great to have you, sir. I'll have you back in the program for a long conversation about the Constitution, the rule of law, and where America finds itself. That will come up in the not-too-distant future. If you're available, I sure hope you will. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Look forward to it. Thanks so much.
When we come back, we're going to talk to Kelly O'Grady because the Federal Reserve made a decision today, long expected, about holding interest rates steady. But Kelly O'Grady asked the Federal Reserve Chairman, you see him right there, Jerome Powell, why? His news the answer when we come back.
A stupid person, frankly, at the Fed. He probably won't cut today. Europe had 10 cuts, and we had none. And I guess he's a political guy. I don't know. He's a political guy who's not a smart person.
President Trump at the White House today offering his assessment of Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. In Washington, that is sometimes described as minimum high regard. I have very high regard for Kelly O'Grady, who is about 25 yards from where I'm coming to you from. Just a quick reminder as we reset the situation for the takeout this afternoon. Power outage in our D.C. bureau, disabled everything. I'm in that black van. Inside of it, there's only room for one. I would have Kelly here if there was room, but there is simply not room for Kelly O'Grady. So she's on the street outside our D.C. bureau, like I said, 25 yards or so away from me. So, Kelly, you talked to the Federal Reserve Chairman about why the Federal Reserve did not cut rates. You got some news there. Explain.
I did. I am starting to think, though, Major, you just don't want me on set. You don't want to hang out with me in person. You kind of orchestrated all this, but I'll forgive you on that. I'll come knock on your van door in a second with some good takeout. But look, we talked to the Federal Reserve Chair today. We didn't have any interest rate change, just as you and I talked about yesterday. We predicted. But I did ask him, I said, look, when does the wait and see approach become too much and actually hurt rather than help the American consumer, because they want lower mortgage rates, auto loans, small businesses want those loans. And he essentially said we need to get price stability. There is too much uncertainty when it comes to tariffs, but he didn't have a lot of clarity. He said, I don't know what way this is all going to go. We don't know yet how to react. So my takeaway coming out of this is we're going to see rates elevated for longer. When you look at the projections, they're still predicting 2 interest rate cuts. But Major, I was surprised we were still getting that because their projections for inflation were higher. And that, of course, leads you to believe that you wouldn't cut rates in that scenario.
And was there an explanation from the Federal Reserve Chairman about the data that is most important for the Fed as it decides what to do, up or down? Is there something? I know we talk about inflation, but there's got to be some data within that data that they are tracking to try to explain and justify the thing you asked about. Like, people might be hurting. Why aren't you helping them?
So what it seems is they want to see how much each piece of the supply chain is kind of absorbing, because he did highlight that we are seeing some evidence that the exporters are lowering their prices. They're essentially eating some of that tariff before they sell to importers. And we know that, you know, my iPhone or many other goods, it's not just one person that touches it. It's many different points on the supply chain where they can eat some of that tariff. So that's one piece. And it's also whether this is sort of a one-time hike to prices or if you continue to see that going up over time. And so what we've heard from him in past press conferences on that point is that if it is just a one-time price hike, that's something that people can get used to. and then they can have price stability. But if it's something that we see continue to go up over time, that's where you really can't cut rates.
Kelly, was there any conversation in the interactions with the Federal Reserve Chair about other data, which I've heard people talking about? The real estate market under some stress, corporate layoffs not skyrocketing, but noticeable, and a kind of softening in the overall labor market, corporate and across the board. Did that come up?
So in terms of the labor market, Chair Powell did emphasize, look, 4.2% unemployment, that's still good. They're only projecting it to get up to 4.5%. That's within the healthy range. But there was a reporter that actually asked about these corporate layoffs and the impact of artificial intelligence that we are seeing on the labor market, that some entry job level positions are going away and that companies are saying, well, we're going to be able to do more with AI. We don't have to hire. I thought that was a really interesting question. It speaks to the times. There's been a lot of information out there with all of these changes that companies are making. And Chair Powell said that's going to kind of have to be a wait and see, but he's hopeful that that's more helpful in terms of productivity versus a huge impact on the downside to the labor market.
The summary for today at the Federal Reserve. Put it on a big banner. Wait and see. Kelly O'Grady, just outside the CBS News Bureau in Washington, D.C. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. When we come back, we're going to have a conversation with Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine about many topics: the Middle East, war powers, the pending economic bill for the Trump White House, and much more when we come back. Welcome back to the Takeout, where we, as ever, are adaptive, conversational, and flexible. Being all of that today, I guarantee you. And there's some news I want to bring to you. A Situation Room meeting this afternoon at the White House involving the president and his top national security advisors has ended. We don't know what that means. We just know that it occurred, and that it occurred in the context of very deep and possibly largely, hugely important deliberations President Trump and that aforementioned national security team are having about what to do or not to do in Iran. I want to get some perspective on that from Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine, who joins us now via Zoom from Capitol Hill. Senator, your thoughts on what you've heard from the president, the reporting out of London that Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, has told his cabinet to be on alert for a potential U.S. strike in Iran. Do you feel like things are moving, and possibly irreversibly so?
Major, not irreversibly. I'm going to begin and put my cards on the table. It would be foolishness of the highest order for the U.S. to be involved in a war with Iran. We should not. When I got elected to the Senate in 2012, having lived through in Virginia, a very military state, the effects of Iraq and Afghanistan on thousands of military families, I pledged in the Senate I would do anything I could to stop an unnecessary war. And this would be an unnecessary war. I think it would be catastrophic for the U.S. to be involved. I support Israel's defense. I support the U.S. helping Israel defend itself. But as we're getting urged to join in bombing campaigns that would lead to retaliation against U.S. troops, U.S. citizens, U.S. diplomatic personnel, I just have to do all I can to stop it. I think the president is still really grappling with this. Everything he has said from long before he was president is that the U.S. shouldn't be at wars in the Middle East, that we're bad at nation building, that we're not appreciated when we do it, and that we need to focus on the primary adversary the U.S. has these days, which is China, and that the Middle East just bogs us down. I hope he just listens to what he said for years and not to advisors who are trying to push him into a mistaken military engagement where the U.S. would join in a war against Iran that would have, I think, very negative consequences.
You have long advocated for war powers within the United States Congress. You going to do so again?
Yes. On Monday, Major, I filed a privilege resolution. A privilege resolution means even one senator can file it, and you will be guaranteed a vote in a short period of time. They can't kill it in committee. They can't otherwise do you mischief. It's kind of magic because it's so important that the matter ought to be taken up by the entire Senate. I filed on Monday a simple privilege resolution under the War Powers Act, basically saying the U.S. should not be at war with Iran unless Congress explicitly votes to be in such a war. Now, importantly, this resolution would not stop the president from being able to defend the U.S. against an Iranian attack. It just says no offensive war. That will likely come up for a vote late next week. All of my colleagues will have to declare whether they think war with Iran is a good idea or a bad idea. I might lose that vote, but I think everyone in the Senate should agree that this is a matter of such gravity and importance that we shouldn't allow a war to begin without Congress having a debate in full view of the American public and members of the Senate and House having to go on the record about it.
Senator Kaine, you said you support Israel's right to defend itself. Do you support its assault on Iran now to degrade Iran's nuclear program?
Well, here's my thought about that, Major. First, I'm very, very disappointed that Israel and President Trump abandoned diplomacy, because we had a diplomatic deal that was working to curb Iranian nuclear program. And don't take Tim Kaine's word for it. Our allies all said that it was working. The International Atomic Energy Agency said that it was working. Many in the Israeli intel and military side said that it was working. President Trump's own Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster, all said, stay in the deal. It's not making Iran from a bad guy into a good guy, and Iran is still doing other things that we have to worry about. But the nuclear program is under control with an inspections regime that will enable us to know if they decide to break the deal. Instead, Donald Trump tore it up. And so now, what are we trying to get? The assassination of scientists, civilians in Tehran dying, civilians in Israel dying, all to put a lid on a program that was effectively controlled by diplomacy. So I'm going to start there. I think this military effort to kneecap Iran's nuclear program is a sad and tragic consequence of the U.S., with Israeli urging, abandoning diplomacy. The second thing I will note is when Israel launched the bombing campaign against Tehran last Friday, President Trump was pursuing diplomacy, and they had a diplomatic meeting with Iran scheduled on Sunday. Israel couldn't have waited 3 days? I mean, it just seems trying to block a diplomatic deal, trying to tear up a diplomatic deal once it's in place, and then launching a military strike 3 days before a diplomatic meeting suggests to me that we haven't exhausted the diplomatic option, and that some prefer war rather than diplomacy. I prefer diplomacy rather than war, especially when in this instance it was working.
Senator Kaine, you have probably read, as I have, assessments that diplomacy might have been a ruse to lull the Iranians into a false sense of security, giving the Israelis more opportunities than they otherwise might have to inflict the damage, personnel and otherwise, that they did.
I have heard that reporting, although, I don't think it was a ruse, but I can see why Iran might believe that it was. Again, President Trump, since before he was president, has talked about wanting to not have the U.S. involved in forever wars in the Middle East. So I think while the president made a grievous and consequential error in tearing up the diplomatic deal, I think he did reach the conclusion that diplomacy in this instance was preferable to war to curtail Iran's nuclear program. And so I supported the president in restarting the diplomatic dialogue, and I don't think it was being done as a ruse to give Israel cover to prepare for full-on bombing and war. But I can understand why some might look at it and view it differently.
Right. Before I let you go, Senator Kaine, you mentioned the Iraq War. The Senate, the Congress, the United States, a fair number of Americans are traumatized by what was said about the underlying intelligence that preceded that war and what proved ultimately to be true and in direct conflict with that underlying intelligence. What do you believe is the knowable intelligence about Iran's proximity, not only to a nuclear weapon, but the means by which to deliver it to Israel or anywhere else?
Much of what I know as a Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee member, I know from classified information that I can't share, but I'm going to tell you what has widely been publicly reported and what President Trump's national security advisor has said recently. And this has been pretty consistent reporting, Major, for years now. First, the Iranian program was under control. When Donald Trump tore up the deal, we all predicted Iran would then begin to build more centrifuges and enrich more uranium, which they have done. But everything that has been publicly reported, including what the National Security Advisor has said, is that even though Iran has done that, there had been no decision by the Iranian government to convert enriched uranium into a nuclear weapon, much less a nuclear weapon that could be delivered in a missile or an other component. The decision had not been made to create such a weapon. And that has been pretty consistent in public reporting and in what you have heard U.S. intelligence officials say for a number of years.
Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine. Senator Kaine, I appreciate the time very much, sir. Thank you.
Glad to be with you, Major.
When we come back, my interview live with FDA Commissioner Marty Makary right here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout, coming to you from our studio van because we had a power outage and all that stuff we've already gone over. I want to bring in FDA Commissioner Marty Makary. Marty, thanks so much for joining us. I promise you we're going to have you in the studio in the not-too-distant future. I appreciate the time you always make for our show, so thank you. When we went to break, Marty, we showed our audience some consumer goods, some of which might have artificial dyes. There's a new effort to remove them, some undertaken by the private sector. There's some scrutiny from the administration. Walk my audience through the necessity of that.
Well, look, most of these artificial dyes are petroleum-based products, and they've been studied in clinical trials. Parents, if we listen to parents, have said that they've noticed different behavior in children. And when they eliminate these dyes, they can see behavior improve. So we've got to listen to all of these data points and not take risks with our nation's children. We asked as an administration for food companies to remove all the petroleum-based food dyes from the U.S. food supply and to do it quickly. And we've been working individually with these food companies with some great results. Now, they see the demand. They see states starting to do a patchwork of legislation, and they see that Republican, Democrat, and independent moms showed up in high numbers to vote for President Trump over this very issue that Secretary Kennedy has championed. General Mills came out with a pledge to remove all these petroleum-based dyes. Kraft Heinz, one of the largest food makers in the United States. We saw other food makers. We're talking to some of the others out there. Mars, one of the largest candy companies in the world, announced removing titanium dioxide recently, which is another ingredient separate from the dyes that we've been concerned about. So this is a great sort of democratic mission where we are responding to the science and responding to public demand.
Is this an example, Marty, of the consumers getting ahead of the companies and maybe even a little bit ahead of the government?
You know, we saw this with sugar. When parents learned about the harms of high sugar loads in the food, that is added sugar, not the complex carbohydrates bound to fiber in fruits. We're talking about added sugar. You started to see the food manufacturers respond, even marketing as having low sugar or no added sugar. And so that created an ecosystem whereby we can educate people and also allow the food industry to respond to that. The bigger question is, what about taxpayer dollars that go to food? And so you've seen the first wave of SNAP waivers, whereby states now are saying, we don't want to pay with tax dollars for these sugary drinks and other foods that we consider to be junk food.
Marty, I want to ask you about infant formula because the FDA, as I understand it, is reviewing it for the first time in decades. And the concern is about seed oil. But some experts are concerned that this review might signal to mothers and fathers that there is something inherently risky about infant formula now. Do you want them to reach that conclusion?
Well, it's much larger than the topic of seed oils, and the data on seed oils is in part unknown because we need more research on seed oils. There is some research that shows that when primates are fed, baby primates and pregnant primates are fed one type of seed oil versus another, it actually can affect the visual acuity of the young primates. That's a study that's been published. We don't want to demonize any one ingredient. But we had an expert panel here at the FDA 3 weeks ago, and they talked about the heavy metals in infant formula. And moms want infant formula brands without the high levels of heavy metals. They want infant formula without added sugar. They want infant formula without seed oils. So we want to see innovation in this space. Part of the reason you have not seen any change in infant formula in nearly 30 years is that it's a regulatory failure. The FDA has basically issued a recipe and said, if you want to be approved in a sort of expeditious way, you have to use this recipe of ingredients. And that recipe has had no changes in about 30 years, except for just the addition of selenium. Well, the field of nutrition has matured a lot over those 30 years.
So, Marty, for a parent who might be listening to us now or in the future on social media, you talked about that recipe hasn't been changed in decades. Are you saying that that recipe is unsafe?
I'm saying that it could be improved, that the field of nutrition science has come a long way since that recipe was put into place, and we can do better. A mom should know that breast milk is the best form of nutrition for newborns. That's been well established and a part of the CDC Healthy Kids 2020, Healthy People 2030 goals for years to increase breastfeeding rates in the United States. But many women cannot breastfeed for a number of reasons, either personal or physiologic. And so for those children, we need to ensure that there are safe and healthy options with baby formula. I want people to get educated, and I want to see the nutrition science that has matured get incorporated into better regulatory flexibility, because we also want to see new products come to market, Major. You know, we don't want to see a supply chain breakdown where there's a shortage and babies literally die.
Marty Makary, there's so much to talk about in this space. Thank you for your time. Come into the Takeout studio. We'll have a broader conversation, I promise you.
Looking forward
Ladies and gentlemen, that's it. I want to thank all those who helped put us together today. This was a fast-moving situation. We're in the van. We got it on the air. We did it. Thanks. We'll see you tomorrow.